then I have the pleasure now, not geographically, but invite our next speaker, Maryke van Staden, who is representing a sector, if you allow me to say. Maryke from ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, which is a global network of cities, city governments, and cities, of course, are very important on the one hand as catalysts, as partners of community investors, but on the other hand, I mean, if we take our definition, a citizen or a city-owned project could also be seen as a community energy project. Maryke, you are director of the, as we can see here, of the ICLEI Carbon Center, and I appreciate you're here because you have other commitments later. That's why we have you now in the program, and we're looking forward to hearing from you, Maryke.
Trying to unmute myself.
So somehow we're back because we saw everything well, and
we hear you, Maryke.
Maryke, now you're muted, but before we heard you and it was all well on the screen.
Let's test it again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Then I'll share my screen again. Excellent.
Super.
There we go. Thank you so much for the invitation, Stefan, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to speak after Monica. Hi, Monica. My warm regards to Adelaide. I want to focus on the role of local governments. As you might know, ICLEI deals with local and regional governments, so I'll give you a quick introduction about the organization, why it's important to act now, focusing on the coherent approach that we as ICLEI present, looking at different action areas and an example, as well as our contact details. So for those of you not familiar with ICLEI, we're a network of local and regional governments focusing on sustainable development. And of course, energy is a core component of that. We're active in more than 100 countries, and we focus very much on the sustainability policy, approaching and dealing with local action that could scale up sustainability, looking at a number of topics, and our main focus is creating systemic change for urban sustainability. So we have a team in place around the world to work with local and regional governments. I found these two calls to act quite amazing, and actually it's wonderful at the time when we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, but also dealing with the climate change challenge. Antonio Guterres, from the Secretary General of the UN, called on everyone, I assume, and this is a New York Times article from which I quote, "A time to save the sick and rescue the planet." And the focus is really on making sure to stop the pandemic faster, but also to deal with the climate change issue at the same time. And what I found inspiring in what he said is the world is on track for devastating climate disruption from which no one can self-isolate, and he unpacks how we could deal with that. I find this incredibly compelling, and I think it's also something that we put forward toward our local and regional governments, as well as to national governments, to say, join forces, pull together. We deal with a current pandemic, and yes, there would be probably future pandemics or other crises we need to deal with, but we need to deal with that in a more holistic approach, also including tackling climate change. And for me, that means directly switching to renewables where we can, and doing this in a fast and efficient manner. The IRENA DG also had a clear mention, staying on course, renewable energy in the time of COVID-19, and he focused very much on the stimulus and recovery packages, which are being designed as we speak, and that this could be used to shift to sustainable, decarbonized economies and resilient, inclusive societies. So it links very much nicely back to what Monica presented in terms of community power examples. From ICLEI's perspective, we recommend a coherent approach to sustainable development. Of course, there are many, many activities happening within a given city, town, or region. You need to work with so many different local stakeholders, but also other stakeholders at other levels of government, within business. And we need to focus on making very clear the roles and responsibilities of every level of government to be able to accelerate climate action, sustainable energy action, but also looking at these crises we need to deal with, which are likely to scale up as we speak. From ICLEI's side, we have 5 pathways that we recommend as a starting point, but in an ideal way, every single city, town, or region out there would deal with all 5 of them moving towards sustainable development. And this is a systemic change that I mentioned at the start. We want to make sure that you're looking at integrated solutions and not the siloed approach that is currently being used. So connect your low emission development. And the focus is both on low emission and development, as well as your nature-based approach, your equitable and people-centered development, your resilient development, and your circular development. If you put that into a coherent package, one can do amazing activities at the local government level in the communities. And again, when we talk about communities, these are not isolated individual communities that don't connect to any others. Let's take the example of Adelaide. One has the city center, you have the bigger metropolitan region, you have the outlying peri-urban and rural communities. If one looks at that, you need to look at that city, region, urban territory, making sure that the services one can deliver, including energy delivery, is really optimized, and you're looking at your different potentials within the wider community. This is especially relevant when we think about renewable energy assessments and looking at local renewable possibilities. Now, when we look specifically at the local government level in this particular space, they administer a geographical area. This could be a city, a town, a district, you name it. They also offer services to the community, education, clinics, health, policing. It's different in different countries, but typically this space is an area where that service delivery to the community requires energy, which also makes it extremely interesting to have energy generated at the local level. And if you combine that with the intention and the interest to create socioeconomic opportunities, even beyond this pandemic, this is a space where there is such potential for action. Now we've got the overlay, you need to support the health of people and the environment. We need to make sure that we give access to services, that we support the vulnerable communities, and making sure that those people who truly need support can get support. But we also need to look at policies and systems that can enable the scale up of climate change. Of renewable energy to tackle climate change. So opportunities to scale, looking at your local potential in the wider region, making sure you have a plan and you can definitely design that plan to ensure access to clean and sustainable energy. In the global north, this typically also translates into reducing energy poverty, people who cannot pay their energy bills, people who cannot afford any energy connection to the national grid. This is quite challenging, but also offers very interesting possibilities to support and serve these people. Multi-level governance and how different levels of government work together is critical to enable this space. I think Monica also alluded to this. We need good governance that enables community power and optimizes the use of local renewables. It's a resource we have, the technology is there. There is no reason to not enable that space. Yet, energy remains quite often a national mandate, but does not trickle down to a local mandate, and that's an area that needs fixing. And last but not least in this topic, access to finance to actually be able to finance these local projects is a clear challenge at the moment, and we need to explore fast and more efficient options for accessing finance. I want to give you one example now in the COVID space, which is quite interesting, looking at socially inclusive wind energy. ICLEI Europe is running this project with a number of partners, and they've released very interesting guidance. And I found it quite sad, sadly, that the perception still is there that external investors really benefit from these wind power developments, but the local community does not. And it is not a correct perception, but I do think we need to learn more from the practical examples of different community power projects out there, specifically now addressing wind, learning what worked well, what did not work well, and pull that into guidance materials that ICLEI is developing. We call these building blocks, and we're busy upgrading our building blocks to make sure that local governments can have a clear guidance on policies and different approaches they could use. We need to empower decision makers and developers to think a bit broader, to focus on benefiting the whole community, but also the investor, also the implementer, making sure that it works for everybody. And there is a win-win-win opportunity in this space. In the wind project, we studied these examples and the guidance. If you click on the links, I hope these would be made available later, gives you very interesting insights into possibilities. Looking at the role of local government, they should be and are, in many cases, leaders, planners, and informers. They also enable, for example, by approving different applications, making sure that the assessments are done, but they also mediate where there is this perception of not in my backyard. There is a potential for discussion as well. These are some of the resources available, so please take a look. We also have a transfer guide to show would socially inclusive wind energy be applicable in your area, and feel free to reach out to our colleague at the ICLEI Europe Secretariat. I want to highlight our Solutions Gateway, a space where we're busy uploading renewable energy possibilities and opportunities for anybody out there. This is specifically targeting local governments, dealing with climate change and sustainable development, and is a nice resource that one could look at. So thank you very much, Stefan, for this opportunity, and look forward to the conversations and discussions later on. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maryke. That was a very, very, very valuable contribution. In particular, how you explained the key role that the local government level has now, even more than before. And then, of course, it's a natural partner of all citizens who are who want to do practical action on the ground. Maryke, again, thank you. Then we go to Japan, and our next speaker will be Shota Furuya, who is working for the Institute for Sustainable Energy Policies in Tokyo and also for the Japan Community Power Association. Shota, you have many years of experience. I think also you did your PhD in Denmark about community power. You work mainly in Japan, but you also have a lot of international exposure. So Shota, I look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you, Stefan. Can you hear me?
Yes, and we can see your presentation.
Okay. So thank you for having me. I am Shota Furuya from Institute for Sustainable Energy Policies, and we are also working at the Japan Community Power Association.